Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody. This is Labor in California, IDS 326-41, the online course, which you should be enrolled in if you're actually watching or listening to this lecture. There is a PDF file with these slides on it as well if you want to print that in advance of any lecture. One of the reasons why we want to look at California labor is that California historically has been a very significant site for understanding the history of labor. When you look at California, and as for those of us who live here, we already understand that California is a space and a place that has always had a diverse immigrant population, even as early as the early 1800s, with Western European immigrants settling here. Post-gold rush, you had the Chinese, and subsequently after that, you had Japanese, the Punjabi, the Mexicans as well. So throughout this course, we are going to look at why we see such diverse racial mixing here in California, and specifically what it means to how we understand labor history. Secondly, in this course, we will really kind of focus on the ways in which race, class, gender, and citizenship impact work and labor experiences. This is a very packed sort of second point, and know that particularly the first week's reading by Evelyn Nakano-Glenn will really highlight what each of these terms mean. But what we want to understand is that based on the unique matrices of identity that people have, they experience work in the United States and work, particularly here in California, very differently. The readings are designed to elicit that type of information and to help provide you with some really interesting understandings of the ways in which different groups experience labor here in the United States and labor in California. And finally, as someone who's trained as a sociologist, I think it's really important for us to be able to understand and differentiate between the ways in which we think as individuals to what is attached to broader sociological trends. In other words, if one person faces hardship in the workplace, is it connected to something larger? So, for example, as a woman in the workplace, you may experience lower pay than your male colleagues despite having the very same educational track record, numbers of years of experience, etc. But just because one person experiences it does not necessarily mean that everyone experiences it. So what we'll do is take those individual experiences and link it to broader trends. What we do know is that women, as a social category, do earn less than men. They earn 72 cents to the dollar. So the idea here is, how do we link the individual to the larger picture? There, as you'll see on the syllabus, there are 4 main course objectives: to understand how race, class, gender, and citizenship impact labor and work experiences in the United States. You should, at the end of this course, have learned about the history of labor in California. Granted, this is not a history class, so it won't be a full history, but should give you a good broad overview of what's happened, particularly post-1900. Third, we'll explore the ways that economic well-being is connected to workers. In other words, how do we tie what happens to workers to the overall economy? Nowadays, you hear a lot of discussions of campaigns like the living wage campaign, or a campaign to increase the minimum wage. What we really want to think about is, what does this mean for the economy? And finally, you should be able to analyze organizing campaigns in California. You should understand different strategies that were used, different tactics that were used, both by workers who were organized, in other words, unions, as well as the counter-campaign against unionization by businesses and other business owners, because it's important to really understand how both of those narratives contribute to how we understand organizing in the United States. Now, if you haven't already done so, I would suggest that you pause this recording and print out your syllabus, or at least pull it up on the additional screen. The syllabus really lays out all of the key important information that you need for this class. When in doubt, you should always refer to it. And know that if you ask me questions in an email that is answered in the syllabus, I will simply respond by telling you to actually read the syllabus. So just please note that in advance. Note that there are different required texts. There's one book that you are required to buy. That book is Karen Brodkin's Making Democracy Matter: Identity and Activism in Los Angeles. You also will have a series of different online readings. In fact, most of the readings for this class are articles and chapters. All of these can be found on Blackboard under the course readings link. Note that I have organized all the readings by week, and if for some reason you have trouble opening any of the files, please email me as soon as possible. I think it's important right here to talk a little bit about what I expect you to get from reading the text. And I think um, not just in this class, but in any class, it's really important to follow a particular set of questions that will help you get the most out of your reading. So when you read most of the articles and chapters for this class, it's important that you answer the following questions. What is the author's central question or argument? What evidence do they cite to support their argument or answer their question? How was the evidence collected? In other words, was this interview, surveys? Did they do ethnographic interviews? Were they participant observers? Were they part of the campaigns? In other words, we need to know how the evidence was collected so we understand any particular bias that may enter into the discussion, so that we can also better understand if the information is just about one person, one small group of people, or a much larger group. Next, you'll also have to talk about what conclusions did the authors make. I think it's important that every author, when they're writing, wants you to walk away with a particular understanding. This walk-away point or take-home point is almost always evidenced or written about in the conclusions of your text. So make sure you take note of what are the take-home points. And then finally, throughout any text, you'll find that most will define a set of core concepts that their entire article or chapter or book will circulate around. It is really important that you make sure you understand what are those core concepts and how are they defined. So for example, in the Nakano Glenn reading, it's very clear that race and gender are very central, and she also defines those, as you will find out as you read that text. In addition, particularly as we move forward in this class, it's not just about the one reading. It's about the relationship between the readings. So you should be able to identify themes across the different course readings. You should be able to identify points of contradiction and contention across the readings. Are you hearing different perspectives? Are people contradicting each other? What we understand is that everyone's reality is different and everyone's perspective is different. So it's not surprising that they would have different opinions or different takes on things. And finally, you should always feel free to ask questions of clarification, exploration, or inquiry. Particularly on an online class, these questions are really integral for me in terms of being able to assess what you understand and what you may not understand. It also can help facilitate conversation across your different for your different classmates. So please make sure to pose questions, and these things can come out in some of the different requirements for the class, as we'll talk about in just a minute here. In terms of the course requirements, you have a reading journal that is due every week unless indicated otherwise on the syllabus. In total, you will be doing 12 reading journals. These reading journals are designed to help me make sure that you are doing the reading and the work for the class, that you are thinking critically about what you've read, and really trying to struggle with some of the core concepts. What you'll also find is that in these lectures, I will also try to, at the end of each lecture, or at least one of the lectures for the week, also try to prepare you for the reading by offering a couple of suggestions. These are also suggestions that I will write into the prompt if I think it's necessary. Some weeks I will actually prompt around particular topics, asking you to think about particular issues. Other weeks it may just be open. In other words, you as the student have the opportunity to really think about or discuss um, what you thought was important or what you thought was interesting from the reading. The second requirement is your participation, which is most heavily weighted off of your reading journal responses. Every week, you are required to write 2 responses to 2 different classmates, posting. Those will be due on Tuesdays. Your reading journals will be due on Fridays, and your responses to your classmates' journals will be due on Tuesdays. These 2 responses should be about 100 words in length, or a couple paragraphs, basically, where you show that you've read, you can pose questions, you put yourself in dialogue with them. It's not enough to say ditto or I like what you said. Instead, you should really be thinking about affirming particular arguments that you thought were important and points, and adding your own thoughts based on your readings. You should cite some of the lecture or readings that you think it helps inform what's been going on. Um, For more information on both the reading journal and the response requirements, you can click on How Does This Course Work link in Blackboard, where I've spelled out the requirements in more detail. And then finally, you will have a midterm and final exam. Both the midterm and final exam are formatted the same way, although the points are different. You will be given 3 questions, of which you will choose 2. You will write 3 to 4 page double-spaced response to those questions. So the exam in total will be about 8 pages double-spaced at most. So it'll be between 6 and 8 pages double-spaced. You can pull from your reading journals. So in other words, the better job you do on your reading journals, the easier your midterm will be. But basically, you will then upload your midterm and final exam on time, and I will grade them accordingly. Since you've opted to take a online class, I am working under the assumption that you, in fact, are pretty good with computers, or that you can manage it. I do expect all students to understand how to use Blackboard. And if you're struggling or you need assistance, I am not that person to ask. The people that you should go see are the Instructional Media Services at Dominguez Hills, and I highly recommend that you attend a workshop to help you negotiate the Blackboard medium. So in addition to that, in terms of requirements and expectations, these are just some general rules that I would tell you that are expected anywhere you go, whether it's in an online class or in person. You should always have respect for your classmates and instructors. In other words, all of your online communications should be done in a respectful manner and not be accusatory. It is okay to debate, but we are debating points. We are not necessarily pointing at people, right? It's okay to critique ideas, not critique people. So keep that in mind as we go through the information. We will be dealing with some issues that people will have very differing opinions on. That's okay. But again, as long as everyone substantiates their point and speaks in a respectful manner, we're in good shape. I absolutely expect that you complete all readings, assignments, journals, and lectures for the course. As noted in all of your Dominguez Hills literature on online classes, and as I've noted online, what we do know is that despite the fact that this is an online class, it's not necessarily meant to be an easy class. In essence, this type of class requires you to be very disciplined, and that you are looking at putting in about 6 hours a week for this course between the readings, listening to lectures, and doing any kind of assignments. So keep that in mind, and know that you will have a deduction on your grade if you do not show that you have truly engaged with all the materials here. Plagiarism and academic misconduct are not allowed. In fact, if I catch anyone plagiarizing, I will require you to meet with me, and under the most serious circumstances, you will be brought up on student conduct charges. These are all outlined on the syllabus. Um, Finally, it's good to ask questions. If you don't understand something, simply ask. Clearly, I'm not psychically connected to all of you, so unless you ask, I really can't tell what you're confused about or what additional information you might need. That said, there are always times when different people ask questions that are already outlined on the syllabus. For example, Dr. Lum, what do we need to read this week? If you were to ask a question like that, not that anyone here would, but if in the case that I get questions like that, I will simply tell you to refer to your syllabus. The reading schedule, which is the final 2 pages of the syllabus, is pretty self-explanatory. You will have to complete all the readings in order to complete the work that's due on Friday. I've written the syllabus, as you can see, on a Saturday to Friday schedule. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. But it's pretty self-explanatory. So I think one of the odd things about doing an online class is really understanding who you're talking to. Um, this is just, you're probably just hearing some voice that's connected to a bunch of PowerPoint slides. And in truth, we may never meet. But at the same time, I think one of the things I've learned in life is that how I teach is very deeply connected to who I am, in the same way that I imagine how you answer questions, how you read texts, how you respond to questions is very closely tied to who you are as an individual. So I thought it's really important for you to understand at least a little bit about me and at least have a little put a face to the name. So on the top right corner, that's a very cheesy posed faculty shot that was taken of me a couple of years ago. In the moving to counterclockwise to the left, that's a picture of me when I was about 4 years old in Lake Tahoe with my dad and my mom. As you can see, it's kind of circa 1970. If you look at the clothing my parents and I are wearing, and my brother and I are wearing. But basically, my parents have, divorced. I have a younger brother. Was very blessed in life to have 2 people who were very supportive of a daughter that chose a very non-traditional path for Asians. In other words, being a sociologist, a social scientist. Was born and raised in San Francisco, as demonstrated by the Golden Gate Bridge there on the bottom left corner, and love the Giants. Yes, I know I'm saying this in LA. Support the 49ers, but that's reality. We're all immigrants and migrants in our own way. And then finally in the bottom right corner, that is a picture at a graduation ceremony. I'm the one in the tomato red gown. What that really symbolizes more than anything else is that I did my doctorate work at the University of Southern California, just up the road from you guys here at Dominguez Hills. I was very blessed in the sociology department there, and I was also affiliated with the Center for, or the program in American Race and Ethnicity. So, in a nutshell, that's just a little bit about me. I think maybe more significant to my personal story and how it's connected to why I'm teaching a class on labor, in particular California labor, is the story of my grandparents. This is a picture of my maternal grandparents on their wedding day, what would have been about 90 years ago now. Now, my grandparents passed away when I was really young, at the age of 10. Um, and so they also only were monolingual Chinese speakers. And growing up, my parents spoke 2 different dialects of Chinese, and so my brother and I never learned Chinese, and so there was always this disconnection. Um, in many ways, this picture for me are like the ghosts that I'm always trying to see. So when I do my work in research, my research really focuses on immigrants and labor unions. I always have their story in my mind. My grandfather came over by himself during his 20s as a paper son. For those guys who don't know what a paper son is, after the 1906 earthquake, this was actually, let me rewind a little bit. What we know and what we'll talk about a little bit later is that the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 effectively barred almost all Chinese from entry to the United States, thus effectively stopping Chinese migration to the United States. Well, in 1906 in San Francisco, for those of you who are familiar or from Northern California, what you know is that there was the Great Earthquake in 1906, which basically burned down the Hall of Records in San Francisco. And so the only Chinese who were allowed into the United States had to prove that they were the son or daughters of merchants. And so what this meant is after the Hall of Records burned down, it meant that many, particularly young men, uh, falsified papers so they could migrate to the United States, saying that they were, on paper, the son of a particular merchant. So those men, those Chinese men, were called paper sons. In today's parlance, they would be called undocumented immigrants. So my grandfather's history here in the United States was that he came here to work, and he worked the fields in California as an undocumented immigrant. He worked all up and down here through California, through the Central Valley in the sort of Fresno area, up through Monterey, on as far as north as Sacramento, as we know is a big part of the history of both the Chinese and Japanese here in California, and as we'll learn about later in class. And so for me, doing the work that I do is about trying to recover their stories, to have a better understanding of what they may have experienced. And since I'll never have the chance to interview them, either of my grandparents, so that I understand what she experienced being left behind in China to raise kids, or his experiences here in the fields of California, where for 20 years he worked, only going back to China a handful of times, and then on his last trip finally bringing his family over to the United States. A lot of my work as a sociologist really is about trying to find similar stories and understanding how immigrants in particular experience work in the United States. I think what we know is that whether that your experiences here in the United States, if you have documents or if you don't have documents, drastically impacts how you're viewed by society, as we will also talk about in this class. But also a big part of what we need to understand is that while we look at individual immigrants, that they are often attached to larger networks, namely their family. And so a big part of the story that I like to think about and that I'll ask you to explore is what happens when families are split apart, and what happens when they reunify. Particularly in the section, there's a section where you're going to be reading Pierrette Honda-New-Sotelo, Transnational Motherhood. It really directly goes into discussions around family reunification. As I've already noted, it's also a story about what happens, what kind of work do you have access to, what does it mean, and what meaning does society attach to work and labor. What are immigrant experiences here in the United States? But also for me in particular, although this isn't necessarily a huge part of this class, is that I am also someone who is highly trained in ethnic studies and Asian American studies. And if you just do a quick perusal of the different chapters and readings that you're going to do throughout the semester, you'll see that I tried to put together a very diverse syllabus. And this is very deliberate because the world we live in is not monochrome, it's not one color. So what I wanted to do was to make sure that I presented you with a syllabus that effectively integrated all of these different components, that it effectively integrated the world as we live it every day here in Los Angeles. And finally, a big part of this class is about both social justice and social change. As a teacher, I'm a firm believer that that with the proper information and that as we learn more, we can make change happen, and certainly that change doesn't happen overnight. But it's up to each of you as individuals to really define what social justice and social change means. And that's really where I leave the end of this course, is around social justice and social change. So here we have a picture of the beach. I know. We'd rather all be at the beach than listening to this lecture. But I have a simple question for you. Is this a sunrise or is this a sunset? Inevitably, as I've asked this in many courses that I've taught, About 2/3 will say that they believe it's a sunset, and about a third will say it's a sunrise. Um, I use this really more as an exercise to say that all of us have different perspectives. Now, in my other classes, a lot of people will say, well, it has to be a sunset. And I'll ask why. And they'll say, well, it has to be a sunset because we live on the West Coast. We don't see sunrises over water. And the people who talk about the sunrise said, well, you're then assuming that she took this picture here in California. Well, long story short, it is in fact a sunset. But what we begin to understand is that there's usually some core sets of assumptions. We rationalize our answers based on the information we're most familiar with. In other words, we live here in California and we only see the sun over the water at sunset. But part of what we do in these classes, or part of what I want you to do, is to really think about, number one, what are you seeing, and number two, what is the rationalization behind it, right? Um, and there isn't always going to be a right answer. What we do know about life is that so much of life is lived, that we try to present life as if it's black and white, when in reality it's really lived in shades of gray. So really part of what we want to do is to really paint the landscape of the world. We want to look at social issues from multiple perspectives, and we want to understand the reasoning or the underpinning reasoning that goes into those particular arguments. Now, as I've noted, and as you'll see in the reading, I'm a trained sociologist. And so a lot of this class is very influenced by sociology. And as a sociologist, I focus on connections between and across groups. I look at social problems and issues and ask why it's important to the general public or to society. And I also try to empirically separate fact from fiction, or common sense ideology. And when I talk about empirically based work, what I'm really looking at here is research. So empirical research, we use empirical research to examine social phenomena and group behavior. So empirical refers to based on scientific experimentation or observation, right? Now, we see the word scientific experimentation and we think chemistry and control groups and all that, and some of the social sciences are that. But there is a great deal of the work that we do in the social sciences that are about observation, about asking questions, about interviewing. So there are many different methodological designs for how we do the work, of which you'll read all different types of methodologies here. But more importantly is this: it's important to note that empirical research, the data is derived from direct observation, experiments, survey, and interviews. In other words, it isn't just one person's opinion. And so you'll note in almost all of the readings, you are asked, each of the readings will usually tell you, this is how many people we surveyed, here are the number of people we interviewed, that kind of thing. So I think it's really important to understand this so that it isn't just about opinions. It is about that any argument or opinion that one might have is really based on a particular set of findings. In addition, a big part of this class is also about understanding social constructions, which we'll talk about in more length a little later. But at its core, social constructions are the meanings that we connect to social categories, right? Um, so one of the examples I often use, and particularly because we're coming out of of what happened to Trayvon Martin this past summer, is that what we see is that there are a lot of assumptions that we attach, for example, to the category of black male. And there are many classes that I'm sure you've taken here at Dominguez Hills that what we understand is that if you were to only study the media, if someone was only to look at media or television or how people react on the streets, we would make the assumption, and the false assumption at that, that all black men were thugs, were gangsters, were violent, etc. What we do know is that this is incorrect. It's racial profiling. But those meanings attached to those social categories lead to changes in people's behaviors and actions. And so what we really want to think about, or I'll ask you to think about in this class, is what are the meanings that we attach to the words immigrant, work, worker, women, class, union, and those sort of things. Another big part of what we'll study here is what in sociology what we call stratification. In other words, the hierarchy that's really developed um, based on these meanings. And this class asks you to think about how these meanings are attached to inequality, stratification, and what kind of material impact it has on a group's access to power and resources. One thing I think it's important to note is that when we analyze anything, that there are many different scales at which we study things, right? And so in this class, I think it's important to note that there are sort of three different levels or scales that we will really look at. One is sort of this macro level scale, the big picture, what's happening at the global, national, or state level. You'll be asked to think about the meso, or you can think about meso as the in-between, which could be about a community or neighborhood. Which has different implications, particularly if you're looking at a particular neighborhood in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Oakland, as opposed to what it looks like for the state of California, or just someone's block, right? But that meso is that in-between middle level of analysis. And then finally, we will also be studying the micro, in other words, individual or small group interactions. But because we also understand that this is where life is lived, this is how life is lived, is at this micro, individual, small group level. So as you're doing your readings, you should absolutely pay attention to these different scales of analysis. So this is the end of the introductory lecture for this class. Know that I will be attempting to put up multiple lectures at a time within a module so that those of you who need to or want to can work ahead. But in preparation for the next class or the next lecture, you should be doing the Nakano-Glenn reading. And as you read the article for this week, I want you to think about the following questions. How does Nakano-Glenn define race, gender, and citizenship? And maybe the more important thing that you should absolutely walk away with is, what is her integrated framework and why do you think it's important? So if you have any questions, I highly encourage you to email me, and I look forward to sharing more information with you as the semester goes on. Have a good day.